very good afternoon to everyone. I, Khushi Srivastav, student of DAV Media School, welcome you all to the Vibrant India series, episode 65. I also welcome all our viewers who are watching us live on Facebook. Vibrant India series is an initiative of DAV Media School for celebrating 75 years of India's independence. This series will be a year-long exercise. As part of this series, we invite inspiring personalities for online talk, interview, and interaction with our students. The invited personalities for this series are from all walks of life and from all parts of the country. And today, our special guest is Sujata Madhok. We welcome you, ma'am. I would like to take a moment and introduce Delhi Metropolitan Education to our viewers. Delhi Metropolitan Education is an A-grade premier educational institute affiliated to Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University, New Delhi, and approved by the Bar Council of India. The institute offers BBA, BA LLB, and BA LLB, and BHMC programs. DME believes in imparting world-class education to its students while training them to develop and enhance their skills. This education and training enables them in taking up challenges of the industry and creating a space for themselves with their competence and vigor. DME Media School is one of the most promising media institutes in the country. It offers BA in journalism and mass communication. It is recognized as a school focused on the growth of its faculty and students through academic and co-curricular activities. Major flagship events and initiatives of the school include BG Varghese Lecture Series, Peer-to-Peer FDP, International Film Festival SIFI, International Conference ICANN, and Vritika, Convention of Media Students, and newly added in the list is VIS, Vibrant India Series. It is our privilege to introduce to you the personality of episode 65 of the VIS. Guest of the day is a personality full of wisdom and motivation. Sujata Madhok is a development journalist and social activist. She is the General Secretary of the Delhi Union of Journalists and the chair of its Gender Council. Her career in journalism spans several decades. She has worked in mainstream English dailies, including the Hindustan Times and the Statesman. She wrote a weekly column on development issues for the magazine Sahara Times for 4 years. She has also co-produced radio programs, including a series on the homeless in Delhi. She became involved in this movement in the 1970s and continues to contribute to debate and activism on women's issues. Among the NGO groups and campaigns that she has been involved with on a voluntary basis over the years are Saheli, the Consult for Women and Land Rights. She has supported these groups variously with research, writing, editing campaign materials, and advocacy. She is on the boards of NGOs like Nirmana, Merit Moli Trust, Ashray Adhikar Abhiyan, and the Daily Media Center for Research and Publications Trust, to name a few. Her research work includes a study of child bondage in the Chowdoji industry for the Center for Education and Communication, a study on the status of women in Delhi for the National Commission for Women, to list a few. She edited and contributed to an 18-state report on bonded and migrant labor. As a gender coordinator for the International Federation of Journalists South Asia region, she contributed to a research report on gender and media issues produced by the IFJ in coordination with UNESCO. She also wrote a chapter on rural journalism for a South Asia Press Freedom Report published by the IFJ. I now request the technical team to show some glimpses from her life. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us today. It is indeed an honor to host you. I now request Dr. Sushmita Bala, Head DME Media School, to welcome the guest.
Welcome everybody to episode 65 of Vibrant India series. We launched this digital program in 2021 on August 9 on the anniversary of Quit India Movement, and we presented episode 50 of this program in 2022 on August 15 when India celebrated 76 Independence Day. Vibrant India series is an initiative of DME Media School, Delhi Metropolitan Education. It is an online series to get inspiration from distinguished personalities. This program has been conceptualized and created by Professor Ambrish Saxena. Vibrant India series is a tribute to all those people who have made supreme sacrifices for the independence of our motherland. This program is a part of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, a celebration on India completing 75 years of independence. Let us look at the eminent personalities who have graced the VIS during the last more than 1 year. 8 personalities from the Defense Forces have participated in VIS till date. These personalities belong to the Indian Army, Air Force, and BSF. These include Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, Dr. P.K. Saxena, Professor R.K. Dargan, Captain Dharmveer Singh, Group Captain Ashok Kechordia, and Mr. Virendra Kumar Gaur from BSF. This list includes a woman as well, Squadron Leader Prerna Chaturvedi. 8 personalities from the education sector comprising education planning, teaching, and research have participated in VIS. 5 personalities from the journalism, broadcasting, and entertainment sector have joined the VIS. 2 senior journalists, Mr. Rajesh Badal, Mr. Shambhunas Shukla, have graced this program, while Mr. Sanjay Banerjee belongs to the broadcasting industry as commentator. Dr. Ashish Kulkarni represents the entertainment and animation industry. Mr. Sunit Tandon, an actor, news presenter, former DG of IMC, and former CEO of Lok Sabha TV, has participated in VIS. Latest in this category, Dr. Rajesh Bhatt, a broadcaster, media academic, and researcher, participated in this VIS. From the social sector, 9 personalities, including 8 women, have participated in VIS. These include Dr. Mridula Tandon, Monisha Behel, Dr. Mridula Seth, Ms. Tripti S. Singhal, Ms. Vibha Lakhera, Ms. Bhavrin Kandhari, Dr. Meenu Walia, Ms. Meenakshi Gupta, and Padma Shri Jitendra Singh Shanti, the founder of Bhagat Singh Seva Dal and Corona Warrior, have also graced the VIS. 7 personalities belong to art, theatre, and literature participated in VIS. 2 personalities from the field of law and human rights have graced the VIS sessions. These include Professor Manoj Kumar Sinha, Ms. Jyotika Kalra. Four police officers have also participated in VIS. These include three former IPS officers, Mr. Amod Kant, Mr. Vibhuti Narayan Rai, Ms. Manjari Jarohar, Mr. Rajendra Singh. Four IAS officers have also graced the VIS. These include Mr. Ashok Pradhan, Mr. Bimal Julka, Mr. DJ Narayan, and Dr. Sanjeev Chopra, and Professor Veena Sikri. 20 women have participated in 64 episodes of VIS. I have already mentioned about 8 women working in health and social sector, one in the Air Force, one in human rights, one in theater, one in education, one in diplomacy, and one in police. I also want to make a mention of Ms. Indrani Singh, Ms. Pallavi Fauzdar, Ms. Sachi Soni, Ms. Saloni Sacheti, Ms. Vandana Mahajan, Amrita Chaudhary, and Meenakshi Pahuja. From the other field, Mr. Aspirawal, Mr. Agustin Valet, Sufi Sayyid Azmal Nizami, Mr. Balindu Sharma Dadhiji, Mr. Satish Saxena, Mr. Ganesh Falke participated in VIS. So today in episode 65, we have with us an inspiring personality, Sujata Madhok, who has been carrying the flag of meaningful journalism since long and who has always been fighting for the right of women. So, welcome Sujata ji in episode 65 of Vibrant India series. Welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for listing out the galaxy of experts we have hosted till now in VIS. I now request Dr. Ambrish Saxena, Dean DME Media School and originator and ideator of VIS, to take the program forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Khushi. So it's indeed a matter of great pleasure that today we have Sujata Madhok ji with us. Since we are a media school and we decided to have this kind of program in the year when India has completed 75 years of independence, and we decided, as already has been mentioned, as to what all is to be included as part of this program. So we decided to include people from different walks of life, particularly the people who makes a difference and who contribute to society substantially. But as I said, that we are a media school, so there is more number of such kind of personalities who are from media. And if it comes to journalism, Sujata Madhok ji is one such journalist who has really made a difference in journalism, in contemporary journalism, with her writings, with the work that she has been doing. And she has always been an activist, and she always believes that journalism is one such tool with the help of which we can try to make a difference in our society and we can take the country forward. So, Sujata ji, as we are grateful that you have spared time for being with us in this program, I welcome you once again. And as it has already been told as to what the program is about, but still, I would like to tell you the whole format of the program, different segments which are there. So after this first segment, which is the introductory segment, I will request you in the next segment to narrate your life journey. And the basic objective behind is that when we are hearing something from the horse's mouth, that is more authentic, that's more credible. Though we know the work that you have been doing, but then when you are telling us all, then obviously we would also like to have your experiences. We would also like to listen to some anecdotes, some such points in your life wherein there were some challenges and how you overcame those challenges. And meaning thereby, there has to be something which we can say the takeaway for the younger generation, so that they feel inspired, and they also try to do something good, something substantial in their society. So without wasting further time, I will request you, Sujata Madhokji, to please take the reign forward from here and tell us all about yourself and the work that you have done. Sujata ji.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the entire DME team for asking me. I'm a little intimidated by this long list of achievers, all the people who've spoken to the media school and well, DME as a whole. But I'll try to contribute my little bit. Since this is a series about 75 years and the achievements or otherwise of this country, let me recall then my own story. I suppose it begins when I went to college and I was only 16 years old, because in those days we began earlier. And so in a way that was my first reality check, because from, a sort of sheltered schooling, being sheltered at home, suddenly I was out in the wide world, taking DTC buses, going to the campus of Delhi University, and facing all kinds of things, new experiences. They were both great experiences and negative experiences. But, well, many things during that period. Let's say how does one define oneself? Over the years, I became a feminist. And when I look back at it, one major factor was what I experienced at home, which was some level of patriarchy, because my father in particular was quite patriarchal, and I saw the relationship with my mother. He was a very good provider. He was a very good person. But he was also the eldest son in his family, in a large family, and he was used to being the patriarch. Now, at 16, I became somewhat rebellious as I went to college, and I wanted more freedom. It was hard for parents in that generation to let go of their children, because, of course, this wasn't a very safe city to live in, to work in, to walk around in. But we were doing it. My first experience of sexual harassment on a DTC bus left me totally like, what is this? But then slowly you get hardened to everything you deal with in the city and in this country, and you carry on somehow. So there was a later phase in my life when I was doing night shift and coming in at 2 in the night, which had my parents pretty worried, and fair enough. When my daughters go out and work and come home at those hours, I worry too. But that's a little bit of personal life. Now, what also happened to me was that in the 70s, the DU campus was quite political, and I was affected by the politics on campus. I learned a great deal, and I was influenced by politics of the left, and slowly I was influenced by feminism. Feminism later, actually, but students' union politics. Now, Miranda House, which I went to, was the only college in the university that was affiliated to the Delhi University Students' Union. So we saw the best of that kind of unionism and the worst of it, because गुंडागर्दी भी थी, हल्ला गुल्ला भी बहुत होता था. But, and for us as women, that was not easy. We were a small minority, but these are all learning lessons. Later in life, these influences came up again and again. In 75, during the emergency, I had just left the university, and it was a very difficult time for many of us. I heard about people I knew being arrested. Some of them in later times became ministers in the government and so on. But at that point, they were students and teachers. There were a lot of arrests. There were people who were on the run. It was a fairly traumatic period. Anyway, during that period, I went by default to the Institute of Mass Communication, the IIMC in Delhi. This was probably the second batch or so. They didn't have a building of their own, and they were very much part of the government structure. In that, it was a mixed batch of students. We had students from Africa who were information service officers. We had all kinds of people. And we had a few people who had no, who were just students, who were just coming straight from university. So it was a very diverse batch. But we learned some very useful things. I remember that we were introduced, for instance, to photography. That was not the time of video, but basic photography, always useful even today. How to crop a picture, how to frame it, all of those things. Also, I learned a little bit. This was my introduction to social science research methodology. And interestingly enough, at the IIMC, one day, we had a group of women visitors. They were professors, people associated with the ICSSR. People like Dr. Veena Mojumdar, who was member secretary, I think, of this committee on the status of women, a government committee, which brought out this pioneering report called Towards Equality. But when they came to the IIMC, they weren't really talking about that report, which had probably not even been published yet. But they wanted us to help. They wanted a few students involved in content analysis of the media from a women's perspective, from a feminist perspective. And so again, that was a great learning experience, which I built upon later in my life. So I think nothing in life is ever wasted, whatever you learn. I remember we were taught press laws, for instance, and frankly, they seemed very boring to me. So there were many things that we thought were very dull and very boring when we were studying. But much later, again, that was useful to me when I began to work with the Delhi Union of Journalists, and also because of personal experience. Now, my first job, was with a small magazine called Democratic World Weekly. The gentleman who ran it wrote to the IIMC and said, I want a couple of people to work for me. And as it happened, he turned out to be a neighbor. So I walked across and said, would you like to interview me? And so he did. And then he said, okay, you can join. When I joined, this was a building called Gulab Bhavan on the Fleet Street, okay, next to Times of India and Indian Express. But when I joined, I learned that actually there was only the editor and me and a pen, and that was the Democratic World Weekly, okay. I was there for some 6 months, learning the basics of journalism, learning, for instance, how to proofread. I mean, learning all sorts of things which you need less and less of today, but we did in those days, when you had linotype journalism. It was very different, page making and so on. Nothing was computerized. There was a press downstairs. Of course, Gulab Bhavan ran that, as I later learned, periodical so that they could retain the building. Because every building on the Fleet Street was given on the understanding that a newspaper or a publication would be run from it. And that is true even today. Although, unfortunately, over the years, most of the newspapers have moved out and retained minimal offices. The presses have all been moved to Noida or other places. And it's a very different kind of Fleet Street from the time that we knew it. And when we worked in organizing people, organizing in trade union terms. Now, on my first job was my second job was at Statesman, where I worked for over a year on the Sunday section. And I had been hired in this very impromptu fashion. I was never given an appointment letter. Now, the Statesman was in those days one of the very first newspapers. I mean, first in terms of quality. It was the paper that my bureaucrat father, for instance, read religiously every morning. It was very influential. But that paper didn't observe basic labor laws, at least for people like me. So I worked there for a year without an appointment letter. At the end of the year, they said, oh, well, the magazine is being moved. Your editor's retiring. The magazine's moving to Calcutta. Sorry, but find yourself another job. And I said, well, would you move me to the news desk or into reporting? I know it's hard to get into reporting, but maybe the news desk. And the very proper news editor looked at me over his spectacles and said, Miss Madhok, the Statesman has never had women on its desk, and it never will. Now, a few years later, the Statesman had a female news editor. But as I said, times changed, those were different times. Anyway, I left the Statesman, I found another job and so on. But on my next job, one day there was an inspector who came in, a Provident Fund inspector. And when he heard that I had spent a year in a newspaper establishment, he said, oh, you should have had a Provident Fund. You should have had an appointment letter. You should have been entitled to, I think, ESI as well, and things like that. So I was like, okay. I didn't know any of this because although they taught us press law, this was pretty theoretical. And I didn't know that I was entitled to some basic things like that. Again, that was a learning, and that was a learning which, so when I joined the Hindustan Times later, I would tell anybody new who came in, hey, look, you're entitled to a Provident Fund. And if you had one in your last job, get the number, make sure that that is added to your current status and so on. But, sometimes it's personal experience that tells you, that teaches you what is exploitation. And from there you move on. So all these were lessons that came to me through my experience. Now, let's see. So in terms of journalism, the mainstream, I slowly realized, was rather different from where I was at. Because the things that I considered important for society were not things that most people thought were news. And particularly in the 70s, the 80s, news was about politics. Now, to me, that kind of politics was very often politicking. It was a he said, she said kind of politics, rather than policy making. So that it wasn't terribly serious, I thought, and it was really superficial in a lot of ways. And increasingly, I became interested in development journalism. Again, from the women's perspective, simultaneously, in the 80s, I was deeply involved with the women's movement. And the women's groups then were fighting against things like dowry, fighting against sati, fighting against domestic violence, and doing a lot of casework, seeing dowry deaths, seeing all kinds of horrible stories from women. And writing, I've tried to write about them, and I did write about them to the extent that I was allowed to, right? When there was this judgment on Muslim women, for instance, there was a judgment about the Shah Banu case, where a very small amount of money was given as maintenance to this divorced Muslim woman. But even that was questioned and overturned later by the government, by bringing in legislation. So there were many things, but I remember that trying to write about that and interviewing a lot of Muslim women and getting rather mixed feedback from them, because often it was, jo likha hai hamare Quran mein wahi hoga. So from that to the situation today, I think there's a lot more awareness among women in general and Muslim women certainly about their rights. So these are things that I have seen develop over the years. when that first came up, the Hindustan Times, I went to the assistant editor in charge of the op-ed page and said, can I write about this? And he didn't know what it was about. And then he thought that, I was just too young to be writing this sort of stuff. So he got a senior assistant editor to go and interview the vice president's wife and get some information on it. So that's the way the newspaper business operated. Sorry. Now, I also began, one year, the women's groups decided that they should do work on media. So I was part of a small group. It ended up being 3 of us who worked on how women were portrayed in the mainstream. And I studied the newspapers and I studied magazines like India Today, which was still very new in those days. India Today, Sunday, other news magazines. And then we wrote about this and we made slides. In those days, there was no video. So we made slides and we took slideshows to colleges, to various institutions and showed them to people to uncover all the bias we saw. We also found a lot of bias in advertising and lobbied with the Advertising Standards Council of India and put our point of view. I remember once that a group of women boycotted pornographic films, stood outside the Odeon Cinema Hall in the morning, opposing some of these films. Of course, that was somewhat misunderstood because for some reason, the people who work for Malayalam films said, oh, you're being anti-us. And again, we had a lot of explaining to do, saying, look, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about art film. We're talking about B-grade cinema. So this was very interesting research for all of us. And I think in that sense, we pioneered media and gender studies. It hadn't been done before. We ourselves didn't know how we started and where we started. Every time we saw a different advertisement, we would share it and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And we came to some understanding of it, of the underlying messages in advertising and so on. All the subliminal messages, many things. And we tried to influence the industry. And at some point, I know that Doordarshan brought out some guidelines, some do's and don'ts from a gender perspective. So there were many interesting things that happened during the 80s, both within the women's movement and in my personal life and professional life. And all of these came together in different ways. But then in the 90s, I had the opportunity to join an organization called the Interpress Service, and which was a news agency headquartered in Rome. But specifically, I was in the Women's Feature Service, which was a feature service dedicated to news about third world women. The news about third world women from a development perspective. So from after the initial training in Rome, I had to handle the South Asian region. And that was not easy because we were operating through freelance networks. I had to get stories out of South Asia. And at a time when there was no internet, no email, nothing. And we were dependent on, letters. And we discovered so many similarities in the region because one year, for instance, I had a letter from this correspondent in Pakistan saying, I'm sorry, but this year my kid is doing the 10th boards. Cannot do any writing for you. I have to concentrate on the child. And simultaneously, I got a letter from a woman in Sri Lanka saying much the same thing. So it's amazing how similar our region is and how little we know about it, the entire SAARC region. I had the opportunity much later to network with people in the South Asian region through the International Federation of Journalists, and that is much more recent because they had periodic meetings. And please note, they always had to have their meetings in Kathmandu because everyone could get there without too much visa trouble. I mean, the Indians could get there and the Pakistanis could get there. And so could the Bangladeshis and the Sri Lankans and so on. So I did this in, I think about 5 years ago. We did this gender project for UNESCO in which we really seriously studied stereotypes, and we studied the status of women in journalism, which admittedly has changed drastically from a very small minority. I'd say we're about, at least in the urban centers, about 30%, 35% of the media today. And women journalists clearly have a voice. Television has been very instrumental in that because they like good-looking women to be anchors. But also women have established themselves in that space as serious commentators as well. Whether you like their views or not is another matter. Now, so one of the things that we found, though, in this study was that it's much harder for small town women working in regional media. And it's very shocking, but in India, for instance, the majority of women who were surveyed said they weren't entitled to maternity leave, paid maternity leave. And a lot of them said they weren't sure they'd get their jobs back if they took that 3 months off. Now, on the other hand, you have the government enacting a law which says, 6 months leave. But the reality in our profession is very different. So these are learnings. Now, alongside my work in gender, I've also been associated with a lot of NGOs, and one of them was a group that worked with construction workers, and we lobbied for many years for legislation. We're lucky to get central legislation in 1996 for this totally neglected, unorganized sector. But it took years to get implementation of those 2 acts. It took years. In fact, it took 12 years of a PIL in the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court every few months reviewing the situation, monitoring, forcing state governments to act, forcing them to set up tripartite boards, forcing them to, in fact, before that, even to draw up rules, to translate the rules. It really was a ringside view into how slowly government can work in this country. It takes forever. So after 12 years, there was a Supreme Court order, said many positive things. And during this period, the state governments were forced to act. They did set up the boards. By the end of it, towards the end of the PIL, we knew that some 30 to 40,000 crore had been collected by these boards all over the country. The unfortunate thing was that the money was generally not distributed. So money that was meant to be in lieu of provident funds, that was meant to be social security, that was meant to pay for education of children, that was meant for maternity benefit, and so on, for retirement. That money was very rarely paid out by the labor departments and these welfare boards. There's a great reluctance in our bureaucracy. I guess we're a very feudal society. We continue to be that. And so that seems to me the only reason for this huge reluctance to actually pay people what they deserve and what they're entitled to. That battle continues. And unfortunately, since 2019, the government of India chose to, quote unquote, reform the labor laws. So among the acts that have been axed, amongst the 29 labor legislations that have been axed, more or less, were the 2 construction workers acts, the CES Act and the Main Construction Workers Act, both of 1996. So those are a huge problem for us.
Yeah, Sujata ji, sorry, I would like to interrupt you here, though, I mean, you have taken us to the point which I wanted to be talked about, like the condition of working journalists. And this is a very young crowd, which, as you already said, that in your youth, you were hardly understanding the importance of whether it's the ESI facility or the Provident Fund facility. And I believe that way the things have not changed much as far as understanding of all these issues by the young people. That is one. Two, the time has also changed, and nowadays people are hardly bothered as to what is written in the Working Journalist Act till 2019, as you already pointed out. And after that, even if Working Journalist Act is not there now, whatever codes are there, I believe that in the first place, the young people, they are not aware that any such change has been brought about too. Even if they are aware that any such change is there, they're not bothered about such things, because the way the media industry has opened up, and right from regular services to the contractual services, and all this has happened. Now, in brief, in 1 or 2 minutes, if you can tell us something in easy terms which are understandable to this young crowd on the issue of working conditions of the journalist nowadays.
See, my feeling is that, see, the Working Journalists Act stipulated, of 1955, mind you, it stipulated working hours.
Yeah.
Whether the industry entirely observed them or not, but at least there were standards, right? Now, the Working Journalists Act and the Payment of Wages Act that went alongside, that came in 1958, have all been done away with by the Labor Code. The 4 labor codes, and 2 of them do apply to us, unfortunately. So we are stuck with, I mean, so now we are, for instance, if you were thrown out of your job under the Working Journalists Act, you had to get 3 months' wages. But now we are lumped with other workers, and so we're only entitled to 1 month's wages. So in a lot of ways, our working conditions, the kind of money we get, all of that has been adversely affected. One positive change has happened, for what it's worth, is that the electronic media, which was not covered by the Working Journalists Act, is covered by the labor codes. Okay, but you know, in effect, you're going to getting nothing new. The Working Journalists Act set basic standards for the newspaper industry, and that were applied to wages as well, because it mandated a wage board. Now, this is very unusual. This is pioneering in those days, that a wage board was set up for the private industry. And every 10 years, we would lobby and fight, and we'd get a wage board, a tripartite wage board, and wages would be agreed to. So scales were set. So all of that has been overturned. It's meaningless now because there are no such things. And yes, permanent employment went by the wayside long ago because it was replaced by contract employment, which is why less and less. And we know that, you know, enforcing in anything in the courts anyway takes forever. It takes years and years and years. It can take half a lifetime or a lifetime. I know many people who are still struggling in the courts, whether they are employees of the Express or the Times of India or elsewhere. As for television, because it was a newer industry, the Working Journalists Act never applied. And now we know that, you know, the work in journalism is much harder than it used to be. Earlier, you could be a journalist in the print media if you could write, and if you were a good reporter. But now you have to be a multimedia journalist. You know, now the same organization expects you to be able to take your own photographs, take your own video footage, you know, do stories for the net, do stories for print, change the headlines, change the style, shorten, lengthen, whatever is required, you know, for the different media that every media house is into. So and no fixed hours. Television, of course, the hours are terrible, apart from just working shifts. So yeah, it's hard. It's a very challenging field. Plus, let's not forget all the attacks that we've had on us, all the trolling, particularly of women journalists, and also the government's attempts increasingly to curb media freedom, to not let us write what we wish or say what we wish. So those are all factors that are coming up every day. Now the digital media is under attack. So every day there are amendments to rules. And I don't know how long the YouTubers, they are a very interesting form of independent journalism. I don't know how long they will be allowed to carry on.
Yeah, Sujata ji, now I would like to talk about another area which is very close to your heart, the feminism and your fight for rights of women. So you have done a lot, we all know that, but nowadays the things have further changed a little bit. It's not confined to the rights of the women, but it's about the right of other genders as well. I mean, which includes the LGBTQ and all. And things have also changed after this decriminalization of 377. A lot of changes we find has come to the society. So what is your take on this, the present day scenario with regard to gender issues, rights of women, rights of other sexes, and what all you will tell us of this?
No, I mean, I understand LGBTQ rights. It's important. But, my personal view is that the women's movement in this country was in some ways very different from that in the West. And while the personal is political, which was our slogan, at the same time, in a country like ours, as all research pointed out, what was required was the empowerment of ordinary people, ordinary women and men, and transgender people. So, and empowerment in economic terms, empowerment, of course, in gender terms as well. Empowerment in from freedom from patriarchy, and that's a continuing issue. But equally, economic empowerment, and unfortunately, I don't see enough of that happening. Particularly, if you look at work participation rates for women today, they seem to be falling, and that is terrible. We don't really know why. There isn't enough focus on that. These are not sexy issues, they're not exciting issues for the media. So the media will talk about LGBTQ rights, but the hardcore issues, the issue of unemployment, those issues the media unfortunately doesn't focus on today. That's my beef with the mainstream.
Yeah. Sujata ji, here I would like to keep this session open to questions as well, because there are a few students who want to ask something. I have got two names of two students who are keen to asking questions. So Sonakshi, Suneja, if you are there in the session, please open your camera and ask the question. And also the Himanshi, if you are there, please ask your question. This question has been put on the chat. Sujata ji,
something about COVID. I just saw it very briefly. There's a question about.
I'm checking this. Yeah. Sonakshi Suneja has asked that after COVID-19 outbreak, any special observation as a journalist you would like to share with us, with the women at the grassroots, or for women journalists in particular?
Well, we all know what happened to migrant workers during the COVID period. It's very unfortunate. It was the first time that maybe people realized that there actually were so many migrant workers amongst us. And, when they began to flee and they weren't allowed to flee and there were no trains, no buses allowed to them and so on and so forth. So that's one. Now, for journalists, there were journalists who reported corruption during that period, corruption in hospital supplies and other things. And a lot of them were prosecuted. This is a huge problem for local journalists, reporting any kind of corruption issues. And I know some were definitely put in jail for some days before they could get bail, merely for reporting it. So yeah, apart from just the logistic. Now, the other thing that happened during the COVID period was it was used to fire a lot of journalists. A lot of journalists were thrown out. And when the employment came back post-COVID, well, it's the demand is for people with 1, 2, 3 years experience, young people like you. But the old people no longer get employment because they've been thrown out and now no one wants them back. If you're, I think in this profession now, if you're over 50, you're a has-been, and that's it, unless you're very lucky. So there are many ways in which COVID has affected us, yes.
Yeah. Sujata ji, here I would like to ask a question that you referred to already when you were studying as a journalism student, the media laws and all. And when we talk about media laws, along with that, media ethics also become important. And in contemporary journalism, ethical issues are really, really important to ponder on. And these are the students in this session who will be studying in the next semester media laws and media ethics. So what would you like to tell these students as far as media ethics is concerned, keeping in view the kind of journalism which is being practiced today from print to television?
What's happening is most unfortunate, corporate interests, political interests predominate now, particularly in the channels, and ethics doesn't come into play. Even if you open a newspaper and see how much government advertising there is, it becomes very clear who's calling the shots, right? Just the volumes of money involved. In that, to think or write independently, to speak independently is hard. There isn't too much room for that, unfortunately. But one must try. One must try to be as ethical as possible and to stick to one's principles. What else can I say to people? As far as the laws are concerned, media laws, there are increasingly changes and curbs. That's another problem that we're facing now.
Sujata ji, you refer to these laws and the press freedom, and definitely press freedom is one such thing which is important not only for the press, for the media, but for the whole of the society and country as well, because the entire structure of the constitution rests on this freedom of the speech and expression and freedom of the press. So what would you like to tell us with regard to freedom of press or the freedom of media? Given this situation wherein the digital media has expanded a lot and social media has become part of our day-to-day life, and despite all these positive changes, wherein the journalism is not in the control of only few, and every citizen, every person is allowed to create his or her own content. Despite this, why the freedom of the press is so much appears to be in danger?
Because it's the mainstream media, which seems to be very tightly controlled. And even social media to some degree. And you can see, for instance, what is news? How come there is so much consensus on what a headline should be every day? What should be focused on, what shouldn't be? News is not pro people for years. And that continues. There's this unwritten rule that you don't cover, at least in print media, you don't cover rallies. You don't. So no matter how many rallies and how many hundreds and thousands of people turn up at Jantar Mantar or Red Fort or wherever, but you don't cover it. And if you cover it saying, oh, there were traffic jams because of all this.
Yeah.
So there are those problems. There is an anti-people bias in the media, let's face it, and that's because of the kind of ownership of the media. Social media doesn't have the same constraints, but people are obviously affected by what the mainstream says. On the other hand, I see that what happens now is that Twitter gets the news and Twitter makes the news. So what I read on Twitter today, I read in the morning newspaper sometimes. So it's an overturning. It's interesting that social media is what now increasingly makes the news, and therefore people have a chance to influence social media. If they're not working for an establishment which says you can't write for, or you can't tweet stuff as an independent person, you have to only tweet what we say or what our company says, and so on. So there are constraints even for people working in various establishments.
Yeah.
Because
Sujata ji, I believe there are one or two questions more. I've got the name of Anshika. Are you there? You want to ask the question? If yes, please ask. And then Himanshi also wants to ask a question. Himanshi, please ask. Please put up your question.
Warm greeting to all. My question is this: for become a journalist or writer on gender, what sorts of book we should read or you recommend?
what sort of books?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, it's hard to say really. There's so much information even on the internet. You don't, if you want to read basic feminist literature, then there's long reading lists, you know. You can read all the old feminists. You can read Gloria Steinem. You can read, I mean,
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
everything.
but Sujata ji, I would like to intervene here. Since you have been a feminist and you have been fighting for women's right, and nowadays one thing is definitely there that all these young people, they are very much concerned on feminism and they want to understand it further. And there are so many interpretations of feminism. So
Hmm.
can you tell us in very easy terms for these young people as to how should they interpret feminism?
Well, equal rights for women and men. That's the simplest definition. But also, feminists believe that they see the world, that women see the world somewhat differently, and that their priorities are often different, that they think health is important, education is very important, people's basic livelihoods, employment, all those issues are very important. And in that way, I think the feminist view, also feminists want peace in the world, and not this much is more, you know. So there is a difference in the worldview.
One thing more I would like to point out here, since this crowd is tomorrow will be becoming a journalist or they might be pursuing a career in other branches of media, maybe advertising, maybe public relations, or because so much diversification has happened over the years. So what would you like to suggest them, the skills or the traits that they should learn, they should try to inculcate, the attributes, what all you will tell them they should try to develop in themselves?
I think you have to read a lot. Read, and of course, now you can listen to YouTube, you can listen to other things, but you have to learn. And also, I think it helps to specialize in a particular field. I mean, you have all kinds of fields, right? You have legal journalism as a field today. You have data journalism. You have so many areas in which you can specialize. All of economics is, you know, business journalists have a lot of scope. So there are many areas you can work in that interest you, but you have to read up and know those fields. That's the most
Uh,
important thing, which means you just have to spend time doing it. Unfortunately, um, the younger people are less and less likely to read. You know, much more visual in their. I mean, that's the world today. But there's a learning process that can happen online too. So I would encourage that very much.
Yeah.
Learning is
Thank you, Sujata ji, because whatever you said will make our task easy, the teacher's task easy, because they keep on telling the student to read more. But when it's coming from some from inspiring personality like you, then obviously there will be more acceptance what we keep telling them all the time. So with this, we come to an end of this session. And if I am asked to tell everybody and to summarize the whole session and telling as to what was the takeaway of this session. So the last thing first, I would like to again make a mention here that if somebody wants to be successful in media, then obviously one should develop a habit of reading. and learning and to understand the things in a better manner. And then, as you already said during the initial part of your session, that nothing go waste. Whatever you are studying will be handy, will be of use tomorrow. So that is something which is very, very important for anybody who is a budding media professional. And then we should always be ready to appreciate the rights of the people, the rights of the women, because as a media person, that becomes our prime responsibility, as we can understand by looking at your career that you fought for the rights of the women, because that is what journalism is, that is what media is, that you have to give voice to the voiceless people, so that a change can be brought in the society, and when we can create a better country. And within the media also, as you talked about the Working Journalist Act, the working conditions, so those who will be joining the media, they should also be aware, they should also be conscious of this fact that they also have a legitimate right to have a better working conditions while working in the media. And then definitely we have to work keeping the ethical part, media ethics part in mind, so that standards of the profession can also be raised, and we can contribute to the society whatever we are expected to in the world of media. So with this, we end this session. Thank you so much, Sujata Madhokji, to be with us. And despite all your preoccupations and despite not keeping a good health, you finally agreed to be with us and told us so many vital things, which we feel is of use to everybody, all the teachers and the students in this session. Thank you so much, Sujata ji. Thank you all for all those people who have the spare time and who are there in this session and participated in this session by way of asking questions and by way of understanding whatever things were told to us all by Sujata Madhokji. Thank you all.
And I wish you and your students all the best.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
The first impression that comes to our mind about any college: tall buildings, big classrooms, large lobby areas, thick books, IT labs, assignments, class tests, and projects. Nothing besides that. Every hour, minute, second spent here help us carving and shaping our persona, cultivating innovative mindsets for the challenging world. Learning is a lifelong process. Sharing knowledge, inculcating values of life, spark the innovative horizons of mind. Fun and frolic is the nature of every nook and corner here. A daily dose of thrill we are sure to get here.